Magic the Gathering has thrived on the vibrant tapestry of its 5 colors since its creation, with each representing not just a strand of mana, but a philosophy, a way of life, and a realm of possibilities. From the relentless growth of green to the strategic depth of blue. Colors define the game, but what happens when those colors are stripped away? When the canvas is left bare and devoid of the hues that give life to the multiverse? All that leaves is nothingness, and within that nothingness, we can find the Eldrazi. These are ancient cosmic entities that stand as a symbol of absence. These Titans of Oblivion defy the structure of the multiverse as they show off the insatiable hunger of the void at the very center of a game defined by its color. So prepare to discover the horrors that lie beyond the spectrum of mana. This is the story of the Eldrazi, their imprisonment, the battles for Zendikar and Innistrad, and what makes these creatures some of the most thematically perfect cards in all of Magic the Gathering. To get a real grasp on these eldritch horrors, first we need to understand where they come from. Typically, we're able to explore and understand Magic's multiverse through the planes that we visit. The city world of Ravnica, the folksy plane of Lorwyn, or just straight up ancient China for some reason. And because of that, planes have become the cornerstone of Magic the Gathering, and planeswalkers have become our eyes into this universe. These planeswalkers are characters who let us explore new worlds, find exciting creatures, and expand on the universe of the game that we love. But the thing is, walking to a new plane isn't like walking to another country. These are entirely separate spaces, and between them is nothing. Only the most powerful of planeswalkers can even survive within this realm between realms for more than an instant. And this chaotic void of endless, incomprehensible emptiness is called the blind eternities. Even those brave few who do enter this space can't even fathom what they witness, as their minds bend it and perceive it entirely different from one another. For example, Karn finds the blind eternities to be a prickly and painful space where he feels both vertigo and stillness, while Jace sees it as an endless, intricate layer of glass that curves and overlaps. To dwell in the blind eternities is unthinkable, however, to encounter those who do would shatter the mind. And that brings us to the 3 eldritch beings which cling to life even within the void, the Eldrazi Titans. These are Ulamog, Kozilek, and Emrakul, each embodying a different aspect of the Eldrazi's incomprehensible nature. They are beings that transcend the colors of mana as we know them. They have no physical form, no color alignment. They are entities which simply exist to feed. However, even now, years since they've been introduced, we still don't really have a true understanding of what these beings are. The spirit dragon Ugin describes them as a man sticking his hand into a pool of water, with the man being the Eldrazi and the water being the planes they interact with. However, to the fish within that water, those who live on the plane, the hand is all they can see of their intruder, and they can't even begin to understand what it really extends into. Together, these titans roam the blind eternities in search of their next meal, finding lush plains filled to the brim with mana so that they can siphon from them until nothing remains. These horrific monsters are the ultimate threat to all living things in the multiverse, and as such, 3 planeswalkers would gather together in hopes of eliminating them. Ugin, the spirit dragon, would use his invisible flame and vast knowledge of colorless magic. The vampire Sorin Markov brought powerful spells to drain their energy and life, and Nahiri the lithomancer aimed to force the titans into physical forms so that they could ultimately be destroyed. However, they failed. The Eldrazi were too powerful to be killed, and so the planeswalkers had to change their focus. If these monsters couldn't be eliminated, then maybe they could at least be contained. And so they plotted to lure the Titans into a single plane where they could work together to sever the Titans' connection to the blind eternity. Essentially, they were choosing to sacrifice one world for the sake of the multiverse, and that world would be Zendikar. While it might be hard to believe, millennia ago Zendikar was a beautiful, mana-rich plane, but that all changed in an instant. Sorin would lure the Eldrazi towards the plane as Ugin used his colorless magic to bind the Titans to it. And at the same time, Nahiri created a network of stone diamonds called Hedrons which would cage the Eldrazi within Zendikar. Their invasion brought unimaginable destruction. Entire ecosystems were obliterated, and the very fabric of Zendikar's reality was twisted by their presence. However, the trio of planeswalkers forced the Titans to a remote location within Zendikar's Akum Mountains. Here, Ugin had arranged the Hedrons to funnel ley lines of energy, which would be used to seal the Titans in a subterranean chamber called the Eye of Ugin. This mystical lock would be put in place, and unless 3 planeswalker sparks met together with Ugin's flame, the seal would never open again. With the threats seemingly defeated, Ugin and Sorin would leave the plane, but Nahiri would stay behind on Zendikar to guard the Eye. But at the very least, her partners would leave her with a way to signal for them if she ever needed help in the future. As the years passed, Nahiri would go on to teach the people of Zendikar about the Titans. But as centuries slipped by, eventually she became exhausted and entered a meditative hibernation. She had done all she could to warn the people of Zendikar about these sleeping monstrosities, but like the Eldrazi, time consumes all, and her warnings were no exception. The legends of these ever-hungry Titans that she had warned Zendikar of became twisted and distorted. And rather than the invading horrors that they were, the Eldrazi were soon seen as gods. New stories would be created around them, and so the merfolk deity of Ula, Kozi, and Emeria were created, with no one left on Zendikar who knew their true origins. Meanwhile, within their prison, the Eldrazi's hunger continued to grow and strain the Hedrons which held them inside. While not entirely able to break free, some of their power spilled over. Ulamog's malice began spreading outside of his prison and infected those who were living on the mountain. Those corrupted by Ulamog's presence would become a cult devoted to the beings that they believed to be deities of the mountains. They would establish a temple and perform rituals dedicated to these gods, and ultimately they would loosen the bonds of the Eldrazi's prison. A fraction of the Titans managed to escape, taking shape as a legion of Eldrazi drones. Zuludok, the Void Gorger, was among the first to be awakened, and it would devour everything in its path as it siphoned mana to fuel the return of the Titans. However, Zuludok also inspired hunger in those around it. As this monster approached, its enemies would become so hungry that they would begin devouring each other. But some of the cultists on Zendikar saw this hunger as a gift. Even if only 12 would survive the onslaught of the Eldrazi Legion, their warped view of the world would have them thinking they were blessed, and they would go on to harness this new voraciousness to become the plane's first vampires. By the time that Nahiri awoke, Zendikar had basically been brought to ruin by the Eldrazi brood and their vampires. She reached out to Ugin and Sorin for aid, but no matter how much she called, there was no response. And so she did all that she could. Fighting alone, she managed to slay Zuludok and repaired the damaged seal to stop the flow of the Titan's brood. But even with Zendikar safe, she was left wondering why her companions had abandoned her, and so she set out to Innistrad in search of Sorin. When she found him, he would tell her that her signal had been absorbed by the Hell Vault, a massive tablet made out of moon silver which could absorb the life and essence of anything not natively from Innistrad. But Nahiri refused to believe this. She saw the vampires on Zendikar, a race which hadn't existed before her slumber, and she blamed Sorin for their existence. Enraged by this misguided belief, Nahiri would threaten Sorin and ultimately drew the ire of his creation, the angel Avacyn. Avacyn and Nahiri would fight until Sorin was left with no option other than to seal Nahiri in the Hell Vault and stop her attack. 6,000 years after the Eldrazi had originally been sealed, and a planeswalker from Kaladesh named Chandra Nalaar manages to get her hand on an artifact called the Dragon Scroll, holding within it the secrets to Ugin's Ghostfire. She would be confronted by Jace, who had been sent to collect the scroll from her to protect its secrets. But while he did succeed in retrieving it, Chandra's curiosity was already piqued, and she would set out on a quest to find the origins of the scroll on Zendikar. She would spend 3 years exploring the plane before finding the sage Anawan and convincing him to lead her to the Eye. Meanwhile, Sarkhan Vol had been sent to Zendikar by Nicol Bolas and finds Chandra just as Anawan tries to backstab her. Sarkhan steps in at the last moment to save her, and ultimately he would guide her the rest of the way. However, they were not the only planeswalkers on Zendikar. Jace had also arrived, and he too crosses paths with Anawan. But after defeating the vampire, Jace would search through his memories and find the location of the Eye of Ugin. By the time Jace entered the Eye, he found Chandra battling an immense dragon. She and Sarkhan had had a disagreement, and he had transformed to battle her deep within the mountain. Jace tries to help, but his magic is immediately absorbed by the floating hedrons inside, and so he thinks back to the Dragon Scroll and suggested that Chandra use the spell within it to defeat Sarkhan. This spell was the Invisible Fire, Ugin's Ghost Flame. And with that, 3 Planeswalker Sparks and the Flame of Ugin had met before the lock sealing the Eldrazi away. Hedrons all over the plane sprang to life and took new forms, bending the very laws of nature around them as the ancient seal had been undone and broken. The Eldrazi had been freed, and each shook their own brood lineage onto the world. But most terrifying of all were the 3 titans who guided their path. Ulamog was the shaper of the physical. He blended muscle and bone together to craft his brood, each being marked with a skeletal mask and blindly feeding on the land as they slithered across it. His creations have no thought but hunger, no strategy but destruction, and leave only dust and memory in their wake. Kozilek, the Bender of Reality, would mark his lineage with floating obsidian crowns which acted as windows to the blind eternity. Simply touching these crowns was enough to kill anyone without a Planeswalker spark on contact. While Ulamog's spawn had consumed mindlessly, Kozilek's brood would infiltrate and deceive. They were thinking beings, and as they spread across Zendikar, the very land itself warped as it was stripped away layer by layer. And finally, most powerful of all, was Emrakul, Warper of Biology. She would corrupt the bodies and minds of living beings until they were unrecognizable monsters whose bodies would creep into coiling roots and horrific tentacles. All around her, life would be reformed in her image. In response to the awakened Eldrazi, Sorin returned to Zendikar. However, without Ugin and Nahiri, he was forced to ally himself with Nissa. He had asked her to reinforce the spell which held the Eldrazi to the plane, however she disobeyed. Nissa instead destroyed the main Hedron and completely untethered the Titans from Zendikar. It was her hope that once they were freed, they would take the opportunity to escape from the plane, but as it turns out, this idea was dumb as hell. Sorin had did all he could, but his ally had actively chose not to listen to his warnings, and rightfully feeling betrayed, he would leave Zendikar in Nissa's clearly capable hands as the Eldrazi continued their rampage, now stronger than ever and completely uncontained. Luckily, she wouldn't be alone for long. Chandra, Jace, and now Gideon had arrived to fend off the Titans. This joining of Planeswalkers to defend the Sea Gate at Halimar would become the Gatewatch, a unified force that had the potential to fend off any threat in the universe. Here, they would take on the Titan Ulamog, nearly managing to overpower him, but as he began to fall, Kozilek stood to join him. Defeating the unified Titans was no longer an option, so the Gatewatch laid a plan to bind Ulamog and Kozilek to Zendikar, while attempting to disperse their life energy until they eventually faded away into nothingness. Ultimately, Jace discovered the leyline patterns needed to anchor the Titans back to reality, and it was Nissa who would trace these patterns onto her world. However, while this seemed to be working at first, the Titans' energy overwhelmed Zendikar. It was quickly becoming apparent that they were not so much being drained as they were assimilating the plane into themselves. So, as a last resort, Chandra ignites the ley lines in an all-powerful flame, and in one final blaze, these Titans were destroyed. Though, thinking back on Ugin's metaphor, it's hard to tell if the Gatewatch had killed the man or simply removed the hand that he had stuck in the water. However, the Gatewatch was far from finished. The strongest of the Eldrazi, Emrakul, was no longer on Zendikar. And that's because, back on Innistrad, Nahiri had managed to break free of the Hell Vault. She had returned to Zendikar just prior to the founding of the Gatewatch, and here she saw that her homeland was being torn to shreds by the Eldrazi, and assumed that her allies had completely abandoned her people. She believed all was lost, and the only thing that she wanted was revenge, vowing to make Sorin's home of Innistrad bleed the same way that Zendikar had. So, Nahiri returns to Innistrad once again, ensnares Sorin's family at Markov Manor in stone, and leaves them there to suffer as she begins her conquest of the plane. She would create cryptoliths to channel Innistrad's leyline energy, and with this, she managed to produce enough mana to summon Emrakul to this plane in hopes of destroying it. And Emrakul's influence is almost immediately felt. She corrupted anyone who came close, turning them into tentacled monstrosities as she made her way across the plane. It wouldn't take long before the people of Innistrad began to worship Nahiri as a god, as she harnessed Emrakul's power to turn humanity, angels, werewolves, and even vampires into her own personal army. Entire towns like Hanweir were corrupted into horrific Eldrazi spawn, while the archangels Gisela and Bruna were morphed into one being, Brisela. Their flesh tore and knit itself back together, their bones cracked, splintered, and fused. As Emrakul melded beings together, their bodies would become one writhing mass which became an extension of the Titan. And with Brisela under her control, an army of mad angels suddenly turned against Innistrad. At first, Avacyn managed to fend off Emrakul. However, as beings made of mana, angels were heavily affected by Nahiri redirecting Innistrad's ley lines. And as a result, Avacyn was slowly going mad. She would blame Sorin for the flaws within her which were being corrupted, and when Sorin returned to Zendikar, they would ultimately fight each other, with the battle only coming to a close as Sorin was forced to unmake his creation. With Avacyn now gone, Sorin was the last line of defense against Nahiri and Emrakul. He gathered as many of the remaining vampires as he could, and together they returned to Markov Manor, where the Lithomancer was waiting for them with an army of cultist and Eldrazi monstrosities. The battle here was devastating, and Sorin would even manage to wound Nahiri pretty severely, but in the end, he lost the battle. Nahiri would encase him within stone, and left him there to watch as his plane was destroyed just as she thought Zendikar had been. Not all was hopeless, though. Emrakul only has dominion over the living, and so the planeswalker Liliana Vess and her horde of the undead would act as a beacon of hope. And she wasn't alone, as soon she would be joined by the Gatewatch. They try to repeat the plan which had been so effective against Ulamog and Kozilek, however, it was a much more difficult process against Emrakul. Jace had managed to set up a barrier to protect the planeswalkers from her influence, but Emrakul slithers into his mind and speaks to Jace through a vision. She tells him that she is incomplete, unfulfilled, and that Innistrad should have welcomed her and not rejected her, adding that this is all wrong. There should be blossoms, not barren resentment. The soil here was not receptive, and it wasn't her time. Not yet, at least. This message probably alluding to the fact that Nahiri brought Emrakul here against her will, rather than the Eldrazi choosing this plane as they normally would. Inside his mind, Emrakul would challenge Jace to a game of chess, saying that if he won, then she would stop everything. They play as she interrogates him, and eventually Jace declares checkmate. But as he does, the pieces on the board grow tentacles. They begin leaking blood and shrieking awful shrieks. His pieces turn and attack each other as they start marching towards his king. And as Jace cries that the Eldrazi had cheated, Emrakul simply tells him that all of the pieces were hers to begin with, and that she is no longer interested in playing with him. Ultimately, the last option for the Planeswalkers is to seal the Eldrazi within Innistrad's moon. Like the Hellvault, it is completely made of moonsilver, which makes it a perfect tool for containment. But in the end, it was Emrakul who would allow herself to be captured. She took over Tamayo's body and forces the Planeswalker to cast a binding spell. And with that, the Planeswalkers would not defeat the Eldrazi so much as Emrakul would choose to lay in wait within the moon until Innistrad was truly ready to welcome her in the future. And that's where the story of the Eldrazi sits for the time being. 2 of the 3 great titans have had their avatars destroyed, and the third is bound within Innistrad's moon. We don't know exactly where it will develop from here, and we're left with several questions. Are the real Kozilek and Ulamog still scouring the blind eternities? And if Emrakul chose to be captured, then what is her true goal? But equally important, how does the story of the Eldrazi translate to their in-game appearances? As players, our understanding of these titans is still limited, but while their true forms are still a mystery, we do have their manifestations and lineages. The manifested titans were first introduced in the Rise of the Eldrazi, with their newest forms being showcased in Modern Horizons 3. Each iterations of these titans demonstrates another perspective of their domain. Ulamog, for example, is the Eldrazi responsible for warping physical properties. As such, their cards largely rely around manipulating libraries and the permanents on the field. The Infinite Gyre destroys a permanent after being cast, and then shuffles himself back into the deck when he's removed. The Ceaseless Hunger will exile permanents and the top 20 cards of the opponent's deck. And finally, the Defiler will exile half of the opponent's deck and then absorb power from the cards that had been consumed this way. Furthermore, the Defiler has a hunger that only grows as it eats, represented by his Annihilator X ability. Next we have Kozilek, the Eldrazi that manipulates reality. As a player or planeswalker, the idea is that we manipulate the world of the game through the spells that we cast. And as such, we see Kozilek tends to play with players' hands. The Butcher of Truth draws 4 cards when he is cast, allowing its controller to manipulate the world. The Great Distortion draws you up to 7, and then allows you to discard cards to counter spells. This stops your opponent from manipulating the game. And finally, the Broken Reality manifests cards from players' hands onto the battlefield, drawing a card for each card manifested this way. This can get you ahead both on the field and in your hand, while also potentially taking agency away from your opponents. And lastly, Emrakul. This is the Eldrazi responsible for warping biology, with this extending not just to the body, but also to the mind of living things. In each iteration, Emrakul manipulates the minds of the opponents and compels them to act or not act in specific ways. The Aeon's Torn tells the opponents that they can't counter Emrakul, nor can they target her with colored spells. She even tells them to skip a turn. As the promised end, Emrakul actually takes things one step further by controlling the other player during their turn. And finally, the World Anew mind controls all the creatures belonging to one other player. As I mentioned though, the Eldrazi appear as more than just their Titan manifestations. We also have their lineages. These can appear in several forms like scions, spawns, drones, and processors. However, regardless of the type, they are effectively just fragments of the Eldrazi, which appear as smaller beings that are separate yet part of their respective Titans. This is why all the legendary Eldrazi we had for so long were just the Titans. All the others were just slivers of those legendary beings. And at the point of writing this, only 6 exceptions to this rule exist. Firstly, are creatures like Brisella, Voice of Nightmares, and Hanweir, the Writhing Township. These are existing beings in their world, which have been manipulated and elevated by becoming Eldrazi. They exist as Eldrazi, yet they are not directly spawned by the Titans. That's why they get to count as legendaries. Second, we have the new wave of Eldrazi commanders. Zulodok, the Voidgorger, as we discussed, has an entire backstory as a specific Eldrazi drone who developed their own notoriety within the story. While he is far from equal to the Titans, he is still known as the subject of legends within that universe. Beyond Zulodok, we also have Ulalek, Fused Atrocity, Paragrast, Erupting Hellkite, and Azlask, the Swelling Scourge. However, we don't yet have any information on their stories. That said, it is incredibly interesting to see this new aspect of Eldrazi's being something that we're exploring more in recent times. Now, what about Eldrazi's specific mechanics? Firstly, the Eldrazi have several keywords and traits that are associated with them. Devoid turns a card which would normally have a color into a colorless card. It's typically given to Eldrazi drones as a way of representing the mana that they have consumed in preparation to feed the Titans. Ingest was another low-class Eldrazi ability, usually tied to Ulamog's lineage. It would exile the top card of an opponent's library when that creature deals combat damage to them. In this way, Eldrazi creatures could literally siphon mana from other players. I don't think this keyword is particularly good, but it is my favorite of the Eldrazi abilities, and if you're looking for a whole deck built around it, I am uploading a deck list on Patreon, which is entirely built around an Eldrazi Ingest mill engine. Very different, but very fun. Ingest also had a partner skill. While it wasn't a keyword, processor creatures would take the opponent's exile cards and return them to the graveyard to activate their abilities. It's taking the energy that has been siphoned and then putting it to use. It takes some setup, but I do think it's kind of a cool concept at least. Kozilek's lineage tended to have a colorless mana cost icon, which was introduced in Oath of the Gatewatch. This acted as a way of specifically separating Eldrazi from the idea of colored mana, which is pretty fitting as they are colorless beings. Then we have Emrakul's lineage. These got the Emerge and Meld abilities. Emerge allows you to sacrifice a creature and put its mana towards paying another card's cost. You could almost compare it to the keyword version of Food Chain, I guess. And as for Meld, if you controlled a specific pair of cards, you could flip them over to reveal an oversized fused entity. Both of these mechanics act to demonstrate how Emrakul creates her brood. Unlike Ulamog and Kozilek, Emrakul is unable to simply summon spawn. Instead, she has to corrupt and transform existing life, and each of these skills shows that off in their own way. You also have Eldrazi Scion and Spawn tokens, which can be created in a slew of different ways, but which all can be sacrificed to produce a colorless mana. Basically, they are the representation of the smaller Eldrazi acting as a food source for their larger counterparts. Then we have the shared keyword for the original Titan printings, and a few of the bigger Eldrazi creatures as well. This is Annihilator X. When a creature with Annihilator attacks, the defending player needs to sacrifice X permanents from their field, and again, it just shows us how the Eldrazi devour everything they come into contact with. Finally, there are a few specific Eldrazi support cards. For lands, they have the Eye of Ugin, which reduces the cost of Eldrazi by 2, while also allowing you to pay 7 to tutor a colorless creature. There's also the Eldrazi Temple, that creates 1 colorless mana, or 2 when paying for an Eldrazi or their abilities. As for spells, there are several Eldrazi-themed or Eldrazi kindred cards, with each reflecting a different aspect of their existence. For example, the idea of devouring mana and life energy can be seen in cards like All is Dust, which forces all colored permanents to be sacrificed. And what happens to Eldrazi after they consume? They grow stronger, so cards like Eldrazi Conscription turns any creature into a giant with Trample and Annihilator 2. Their dominance can be seen in cards like Not of This World, which counters a spell or ability that targets your permanents. Not only that, but it becomes free if you have a large enough creature on the board. Many Eldrazi spells demonstrate how they spread, multiply, and swarm, so we have things like Skittering Invasion, which creates 5 Eldrazi spawn, or the new Eldrazi card, Echoes of Eternity, which is an enchantment that copies triggered abilities of colorless cards, as well as copying colorless spells that you cast. I think that my favorite part of Eldrazi cards as a whole, though, is that all of them feel like such a cohesive unit. There aren't really any which feel out of place, and it's one of the coolest tribes in the game because of this clarity in their design. They do so many different things, but all of those things lean into consumption, dominance, and corruption. And by making this tribe something that is so coherent with their identity, Eldrazi's can turn your library into just another story of their invasion. But with that, we have the complete story of the Eldrazi and how they are incorporated into the game. Which Eldrazi is your favorite, and how do you like to build your Eldrazi decks? Personally, I've always liked Emrakul, but honestly, I kinda like playing this goofy mill Eldrazi deck which focuses on the ingest mechanic. Like I said, if you're interested in that, I'll be posting a link to that deck over on Patreon, so be sure to check that out if you're looking to play something a little bit different. Or you can check out my video on the set that changed Magic forever, which I also uploaded today. But with that said, I am officially out of mana, so I'm going to end things here. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.